3. We're in Ashby, Massachusetts, here in the town hall. This videotaped interview that we're doing today is being done by the Ashby Historical Society, participating in the United States Veterans History Project. It's a project in which our veterans have been asked to share their experiences and their stories, so they'll be on record. The tape that we're making will be kept right here, and then it'll be listed and cataloged at the Library of Congress. And so with us today is Sybil Hayes, being interviewed by Janet Offris. And Sybil, how long have you lived in Ashby?
Since 1946.
Since 1946. So they've spent quite a lot of your life here.
Most of my life. I came here as a bride.
And your husband was?
Leonard Hayes.
Leonard Hayes. And he was a lifelong, he was a native here, wasn't he?
No,
he wasn't.
He came here when he was 2.
Okay.
From Fitchburg. His family moved up here in 1925.
So he brought you back to his home. Well, let's start with your service experience. What you were a nurse.
Yes, I was.
Give us a little history of where you did your training and then how you ended up deciding to go into the military.
I'm a graduate of the New England Baptist Hospital in Boston. And I graduated in 1944. And 7 of us decided that we were going to go into the service. And much to the chagrin of the people at the hospital, we all left. I had originally hoped to go into the Navy, but they were not shipping any females overseas, and I wanted that experience, so we joined the Army. In January of 1945, we signed up, pending the outcome of our state boards. And in March, I reported to Fort Devens for basic training and was commissioned as 2nd lieutenant.
Where were you born? Where did you?
I was born in East Ridge, New Hampshire, at home. And
so then you went clear to Boston. That was quite a step.
Well, I was living in Winchendon.
Okay.
At the time that I enlisted. In fact, my early years were all in Winchendon. I graduated from Murdoch High School and then went to Boston to train.
Did you go with anyone you knew, or
No.
You didn't know anyone? So
No.
the 7 of you just met and did school
Well,
together.
this is after the 7 of us were those that had graduated. We were all RNs by that time to go into the service. We had all graduated. But I met up with a girl from Guilford, Connecticut, and we traveled everywhere together and came home together.
Good. Were you able to bunk together, as they say in the
Well,
Army?
yes, so to speak. Yes, we were together all the time.
So where did you go? Now that's the next. You wanted to go overseas, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And I had my basic training at Fort Devens. Then I went to Cushing General, where I worked for a while. Then we were sent back to Devens to process for overseas duty.
Now let me interrupt you. Where is Cushing General?
Framingham.
Okay. Is that a training?
No, but it was just a hospital where they had a lot of veterans there. And we worked there for a while and then went back to process for overseas. And we were at Fort Devens for a while, and then we started on a troop train for the South. And I was in Fort Jackson, South Carolina at the time of VJ Day. And we went from there on to New Orleans, Louisiana, where we eventually boarded a hospital ship. There were 900 nurses on that hospital ship, headed out, and we went down through the Panama Canal, and which was a good experience. And then we went on from that was the first big screening of nurses, and all nurses there, we lost all the married girls were sent back to the States because the war was definitely ending. And we went on to Pearl Harbor, where we boarded another ship in Panama and sailed on the Thistle to the Hawaiian Island. And we were going to just stop overnight, and we ended up and spent 2 weeks there, so we had a grand time seeing the islands and so forth.
900 nurses, huh?
Well, they had screened some of them,
Oh,
and
that's
then in Hawaii, they screened the next big bunch, and all those that were 29 years of age or older were sent back to the States. And we went on from there to Yokohama. No, we went to Manila, and we arrived in Manila on November 11th. And it was a holiday, so we sat out in the bay. And of course we saw all the half-sunken ships in the Manila Bay and so forth from the war. And
Let me interrupt you. November 11th is our Armistice Day. Do they celebrate, is that the same holiday?
well, it was
there?
with the American forces that were there.
Right.
Yes. So I was stationed at Santa Tomas University, which was then the 4th General Hospital, which was an area that was bombed by the Allies without realizing that there were Americans there. But MacArthur had said he would return, and he did, and freed it eventually. And then we closed that hospital and turned it back to the to the Philippine government to be used again as a university. And from there we went to the small island of Mindoro, south of Luzon, where we were with the, I can't remember the number of the unit, but it was a station hospital. We were all in tents and so forth. And we worked there until we closed that hospital. We were a unit that was going around closing up a lot of these military installations.
So what kind of thing would that entail? You say closing it up, you would, what happened to the patients that were there?
Well,
They
some of them were,
transferred, or-
yes, a lot of them were shipped back to the States.
Okay.
Those that were able were returned to duty, and otherwise they were shipped back to the States.
So you made those decisions, that the
Right.
ones who should...
Right. And we were there for over Christmas, and it was hot. It wasn't a typical Christmas for me, being a New Englander.
For sure.
And then we went back to a depot, and we were transferred to Yokohama, Japan, by way of Korea. We stopped at Korea on the way, and we went from this terrific heat to very, very, very cold weather. We went ashore in Incheon, Korea, and then went on to Yokohama, where we set up the 334th Station Hospital, which was a department store that had been made over for wards and so forth. And I was in charge of a group of 6 Quonset hut hospital wards that had everything from communicable diseases to venereal diseases. And I didn't have to do much in the 2 wards that were the venereal disease because they had the boys that were the medics that did most of that work. Then finally, after we had stayed there quite a while, and that was left standing, and that was still in operation when I left there, we headed for home. We finally got enough points and enough time in the service, and they were shipping us home. So this friend of mine from Connecticut and I, who were still together, managed to come home to San Francisco by way of a cargo plane. There were 4 Red Cross workers and we 2 nurses who sailed into San Francisco. And we had a couple of days there, and then we came across the country Pullman, civilian Pullman, which was very good because the rest of our group came into Seattle and they came across as a troop train.
Oh, that's quite different.
And we were taken to Fort Dix, New Jersey, where we were eventually discharged. And I went back to Winchendon.
And so then where did your husband come in?
I met him the day that I got home. A friend of mine, a girl who had always been a friend of mine in Winchendon, and I were headed to the movies. I didn't have any civilian clothes that fit, so I was in my uniform. And we were going to the movies when I met the girl who was now my sister-in-law, and she wanted me to go out and meet this fellow, and I said, I'm not interested in meeting anybody. But I met him and 4 months later married him and ended up here in Ashby.
You had a long and happy life together. You were married for how many years?
49 and a half.
49 and almost 50.
Almost 50 years, yeah. 49 and a half to the day.
To the day. And what year did he die?
He died in 96.
Well, I want to go back a little bit. I'm curious about the Yokohama. Now, were those American soldiers that you were nursing?
Yes.
So
most of them were.
How did they get to Japan?
Well, most of them were stationed in Japan, and what we did from the war was over.
Okay, so they were.
They were mostly casualties from fighting over the geisha girls and that sort of thing. Oh, they fought terribly over them. Oh, yes, they did a lot of fighting over them. And they were gunshot wounds and that sort of stuff.
Okay, so I'm having a little problem relating. We were not on the mainland before the dropping of the bombs, the atomic bombs of Japan, were we? So these people, this was our occupation force
Yes.
that moved in?
Yes, occupation forces.
Okay, that is interesting that their fights were over the geisha girls.
A lot of them were. A lot of them were, yes. And I mean, occasionally you've got an appendix case or things like that, but most of them, they were not war casualties.
They were not war casualties.
No.
Okay. So, I guess I would be curious to know a little bit more. You got you had experiences on different boats. You had,
But
these met with all your hopes. You know, you wanted to go overseas, and you certainly had good experience
Yes, I
as
did.
far as different areas.
Yes, I did. I had some very, very interesting experiences with overseas and seeing some of the country and so forth. I was in Tokyo and things like that. So I saw a lot of that.
When you went, like if you went to Tokyo, were you in uniform?
Oh, yes.
You were always in uniform?
Oh, yes, we had to be. That was dress code.
And what was, did you get out into, like, did you stay pretty much where the Americans were, or did you get out
yes.
into pretty much?
We did. I didn't, but the girls that were there after me did climb Mount Fuji.
Is that right?
I saw Mount Fuji.
Saw it.
I was at the base of it, but I never climbed it.
Well, how did, let's see, this was after the war, so you didn't have a problem with messages to your home and all this kind of thing?
No.
That was, all the censorship and everything was over by then, probably.
Yes, yes.
So there was good communication.
Yes. I left a mother and I left a brother my brother was in the Navy and was stationed in England, had to do with the invasion of Europe. But he was in a lot before I was in. But he came home not too long before I did.
Really? Was his being in the service, did that influence you to want to go? Or did
No.
you just want to get out?
No, I had this friend of mine in Winchendon, who is still my best friend. We went to school together and so forth, and her sister had been in the Army Nurse Corps and was my inspiration to go. She had spent 3 years in the Pacific.
3 years.
Through all the war. Yeah, she had some rough duty over there.
So she probably had a lot of stories. Is she still living?
Yes, but not well. She lives out in the Midwest.
Oh, she's not in Wichita.
No,
Yeah.
no.
Well, let's see. How would the food at that time, were things pretty well?
Yes, I missed milk. One of the most things that I missed, because we had nothing but powdered milk. And I always had been a milk drinker, and I missed milk really the most of anything.
How about ice cream then? No ice cream? Or
No.
No.
No ice cream.
Yes. So which place that you were is the most strongly imprinted in your mind? Which will you remember, or have you remembered the most of those different places you were?
Well, we weren't in a place that long to determine too much of that, although I did like the island of Mindoro because the powers that be there were not as demanding of us to not mix with the personnel. We would sit on a hillside and watch a movie with the enlisted personnel as well. Of course, being an officer, we were not supposed to fraternize with the enlisted personnel, but there, everybody was alike, and we were all away from home, and they were great. There was a major that was the head of it all, and he was super to us. So I enjoyed
So it was in his power to
Yes.
allow that to happen.
Yes.
Other than that, well, that's true. Did you keep a diary at all when you were doing
No,
that?
but my mother saved every letter
Oh, really?
that I wrote home, which is like a diary. In fact, I
Yes.
just recently reread those letters. She saved them all and gave them to me, and they are all in sequence and so forth, and it tells in there a lot of the things that we were doing that I wrote home about.
Well, tell us some of those things.
Well, they were just what we were doing and where we were and so forth, and there was nothing that hindered as far as not being able to do that. We could do what we wanted and say what we wanted to.
Right.
So,
Do you regret that you were not in during the war, during the actual war?
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
well, I would have liked to have been there during the battles and so forth, because we saw a lot of the results of a lot of that, and but I was just too late. I trained during those years the war years, which was very difficult because we lost so many of the nurses from our hospital, and we were expected to take over in the civilian hospital to do things. And I really wish that I could have been in earlier, yes.
So how old were you actually when you deployed on the ship? Or
Well, when I entered the service, I was 21.
21.
I turned 22 very shortly after that. So it was during those years. Yes, I would like to have been in more of what was going on. We saw Bataan and Corregidor, of course, when we were stationed in the Philippines. And Halsey's Third Fleet going out and so forth, things like that.
In the time leading up to the war, tell me what it was like to ration and the things that you were in school, but were you living at home?
No, I was living at the hospital.
At the hospital. Tell me about your day-to-day.
Well, because we were fortunate being in a medical facility, we were not deprived of anything. We had real butter, and we had everything that we needed because it was a hospital. And in fact, my mother would go out and buy a quarter of a stick of butter when she knew I was coming home, because I didn't care for oleo, and of course she was using oleo and things like that. But we were not deprived of anything.
She had probably had to save up her ration
Oh yes.
coupons so she could have butter for you.
Oh yes.
So did you get home quite often when you were in nurses training? Or was that pretty
Well,
restricted?
no, because, well, number one, it was a costly thing. I had to come up by train, and it was costly, and my mother just didn't have that kind of finances and so forth. So, and lots of times I would work on a holiday to let the girls go home that had family, more family than me, Christmases and Thanksgivings and so forth.
So I do know that you are a member of the American Legion.
Yes, I am.
That you have. Did you join right soon after you?
I
came back?
did, and then I took my membership out of there. But I have been a member now for, I don't know, close to 30 years again, because I went back into it again. And that was strictly a matter of, it was one of those things that I figured we were struggling and so forth, and the dues were not that great, but yet it was one thing I figured I could. My husband was a charter member of that post.
I see. So now after you're married, you did have children.
Yes, I have two.
You have two children.
I have a daughter, Linda, who lives in Philadelphia, or outside of Philadelphia. And I have a son who is in North Carolina. And I have two granddaughters.
Two granddaughters. How old are they?
22 and 24.
Have you told them about these these letters that you have, and is somebody going to keep them in the family?
I doubt it.
Have you told them about them?
Yes, they know that they're there. They know that I have them, but I probably will burn them all someday.
Oh, don't do that.
Please give them to the society
Give
before
them
you
to
do
the
that.
society before
We'd
you
be
burn
very
them.
interested to have them.
Well, I think there's too much personal business in them.
Well, and I can understand that,
yes.
respect that.
I can see that too. Yeah.
Because they were all written to my mother.
Yeah. Did any of your children follow you in military career?
Or nursing,
No?
medical?
No? No?
Well, I think you were, I would have to say that was you were a pretty venturesome person.
Well, I enjoyed what I did, and I enjoy thinking about it today, and it's hard to realize that I ever was that far away,
I bet.
and but I was.
So then, have you ever, you didn't practice nursing as a civilian, did you, or did you?
For a very, very short time after I was married. But basically, I was a stay-at-home mom and brought up my family.
Right here in Ashby. And you built the house that you live in now, right?
Yes, we did. We literally built it ourselves. Yes, we had the rough frame put up and then we built it.
Now, who was, you live right beside David Damon, your houses are rather similar. Who was the first one to build? You or David? David built.
David and Harriet had been there 2 years when we moved into our house.
Now, is there a relation at all between you? No.
But they were the first people, Dave and Harriet and her mother and father were the first people that Len introduced me to when we started going together. So we've been friends for a good many, many years. We've lived side by side for 50 years.
That's quite something. So now, did you get any special emblems as having been a nurse in different places, or how did that work with the Army nurses?
No, I didn't have it.
You just had your bar, your lieutenant bar.
Yeah, second lieutenant.
Second lieutenant bars. Do you have any other questions, Ann?
No, but is there any